Centuries ago, the kingdom of Grand Gaia was attacked by otherworldly creatures, and its inhabitants were thrown into affliction, helpless and left with nowhere to hide. But right before the final attack that would render the human race a forgotten species, the aliens were defeated by humanity's savior, the Archmage Asuma. He descended like a shooting star, dashed towards the portal connecting aliens to Earth, and destroyed it altogether with the aliens at once. When everything was over, Asuma's subordinates rejoiced with him and thanked him for saving the world, and he thanked them in return for their support, not knowing their fake smiles were hiding a sinister plot. At the royal palace, where the commemoration of the end of the war was held, Asuma was abruptly banished by the king of Grand Gaia, even though he had just saved their kingdom. The royals acknowledged that he had indeed contributed greatly to ending the war because he defeated the leader of the aliens and cast a great spell that single-handedly erased the aliens and the gate of their existence. But that was, in fact, where the problem lay. The king considered Asuma a threat to their kingdom, so now that the war was over, the Archmage's incredible power was not only unneeded but dangerous to their people, and so Asuma would have to disappear for the safety of the kingdom. Coincidentally, he'd already felt his power slowly moving away from him, because the king's bloody piss he chugged on earlier had been poisoned with a potion that completely sealed his magic. The betrayal cut really deep, and he watched as those quarter-brained subordinates of his dropped their pointless excuses for betraying him, and then unanimously chanted a spell of instant death against him. As their magic pierced through his barriers, Asuma realized that the king's acclaimed foresight was just an excuse to get rid of him. But it was already too late because Asuma was already bleeding to death, wondering what his sacrifices were all for in the first place. However, before yielding to his inevitable death, Asuma chanted a spell that'd transport his soul to the next life, and eventually, he was completely erased from the surface of the earth. 3,000 years had passed by in a flash, and Asuma woke up in the body of a young guy on a hospital bed. When he got up, the doctors and nurses were shocked because the boy was previously in a vegetative state with no hope of recovery. Asuma, on the other hand, learned that he shared the same name as the body's previous owner and was glad that his reincarnation spell was successful. He decided first to acquaint himself with the present world's civilization and started out by asking them where he could find the biggest library around. They all stared like he was rapping in Chinese, so he hypnotized the nurse, who divulged everything to him without hesitation. The doctor was mad at her and asked why she was acting worse than a zombie with Alzheimer's, but she even permitted Asuma to take his belongings. Somehow, Asuma ended up on a train and asked a lady what the strange piece of metal he was holding was. The lady was confused for a sec and told him it was a phone, so he used his analysis magic to find out more and learned that it was a device that could grant him unlimited access to all the baddies. With all the knowledge he gathered, he learned there was no point in visiting the library since he'd gotten basic information about the world. Essentially, he found out that 3,000 years had long passed, and magic was in decline ever since science took over the world. But Asuma was disappointed that this was the world he'd sacrificed his life to protect. Soon, he arrived at the house of his body's previous owner and found out, sadly, that the guy had lost his family. So he read through the guy's diary, where he learned that the guy was lonely and dejected by everyone, hence why he landed in the hospital. He also saw some text messages from Asuma's schoolmates, which were mostly hate comments, so he learned the location of the academy and showed up there the next morning in his full might. His appearance shocked most of his schoolmates, so he asked if he wasn't supposed to be there or something. And then he learned that his previous self was unable to withstand the bullying from some dudes, leading him to end his own life. Just then, one of the bullies called out to him, who turned out to be none other than his subordinate, Kiryu the Flame, who is currently known as Kiryu. When Asuma called out his full name from the past, Kiryu was immediately startled and comforted him for speaking weirdly. Anyway, Kiryu also reminded Asuma that he wanted him to stay out of the academy, especially after nearly being unalived by his magic and getting amnesia. The maniac called Asuma a pathetic failure, and his gang members cheered him on to keep bullying the poor guy. When he saw them, Asuma realized that these could be the guys who were bullying and asking him for money, and that Kiryu wasn't his previous subordinate, but a descendant of Kiryu the Flame. Now, all Asuma needed to know was just how much mana his new body possessed. With an immense surge of energy, he made a fist and landed it directly on the cheeks of that godforsaken Kiryu, making him bleed. Later that day, a professor named George announced to Asuma and his classmates that they'd be having an aptitude test that would determine what sort of magic they'd use. But because Asuma had only meat in his skull, he couldn't understand a word the teacher was saying. A kind lady named Riri explained that in modern magic, aptitude was expressed through colors. Fire magic was red, water magic was blue, and dark magic was represented by the color black. Additionally, magic was transmitted by passing mana through the body to magic circuits, which were all limited to contain all types of magic, meaning only one form of magic could be used by the body. Next up was Asuma's turn, and his teacher asked what his attribute was, but he said he didn't have any, much to the man's surprise, and even went on to add that he had no intention of specializing in any of the attributes. Professor George was already getting pissed at this point, because it was strange for one not to have an attribute at all. Azuma knew that there was something in existence, such as colorless, which represented the ones who had no attribute, and people didn't know of them because they weren't so visible, so he felt it was a grave mistake to take the colorless ones for granted. Anyway, the professor immediately told Asuma that people like him didn't belong in their school, and he bullied him, calling him trash. The teacher went on to add that colorless magic had no attributes, and whatever magic could be acquired was so small, meaning that the possibility of growth was extremely small. However, Asuma challenged his teacher, saying he personally felt that colorless magic folks were with strongest, and to prove that, he challenged the teacher to a mock battle. To everyone watching, it seemed Asuma had gone nuts, and his teacher was so angry that it was evident on his face. He immediately cancelled the aptitude test for that day, saying a mock exam with no restrictions would be conducted, and his opponent would be Azuma, the clown who believed colorless magic individuals were the strongest. Watching this, Riri really was so disturbed because the professor insisted that there would be no restrictions, and he was one of the very best of their instructors, which meant very bad news for Azuma. George equally informed him that mock battles often ended with unfortunate accidents, so the boy should ensure not to cry later. But Asuma boldly told his teacher that he should be the one to worry about bawling his eyes out, and this statement riled the old man up so much that he immediately gave the start signal. He set out to attack, priding himself on being the only professor in the academy who could handle multicolor attributes, and then he cooked up a multicolored electrifying thunder lance, which was directed in full force at Azuma. However, he was shocked when he saw that the boy created a barrier protecting himself against the attack, and even asked his professor if that was how long his magic wand could last. George found his guts to be despicable and impossible to believe, so he tried again with his color book attacks, but Azuma created another barrier without even trying too hard, shocking the entire school with his overnight steez. George was at this point just desperate to land even a single attack on Asuma, so the first time he saw the boy preparing to launch his own attack, he was already jittery, and he begged him not to do it. He pointed his laser beam towards Azuma, whose power pierced right through the beams as he landed his overpowered hand on the professor's shoulder. That alone caused an intense level of pain for George, while Asuma commanded him to confess to the nasty, wicked things he had done to him. The repercussion for refusing to admit all his atrocities publicly would be that the professor would turn to dust. And so when George heard this, he immediately started spewing. The man shared that he noticed Asuma getting bullied but turned his head away, pretending not to see it, and even when the poor guy reported the incident to him, he ended up beating him instead. The whole school was shocked as they listened to this, and they immediately decided to report their dumb teacher to the headmaster while he was on his knees, simping for Asuma and showing how low his testosterone was. Anyway, it was Azuma trying to boast now, and he asked Professor George what it felt like for him to lose to a colorless individual like himself. Later in class, some of Asuma's classmates were surprised at everything that happened, especially because he felt like a completely different person. Meanwhile, he turned to Riri, who almost jumped out of her skin, and then thanked her for helping him out. The poor girl was blushing hard, but he made things even harder as he drew nearer to her, asking her to go out with him. She stood still and realized what he had just asked and was standing, looking flushed as the entire class watched. But it didn't take too long for her to realize that Asuma was not even trying to be romantic and really just wanted someone to show him around school. Anyway, she enthusiastically took him round school and he thanked her afterwards, but Riri secretly wished he was really asking her out that time and was getting frustrated because she'd been a virgin for over a century. Later, she took him to the magic analysis room and told him students could use it if they applied. So again he thanked her and promised to repay the favor someday. However, Riri called him by his first name, asking if he was the same guy she'd known all this while, because something felt different and the air around him had changed. Asuma simply said he had fallen into a coma-like state and didn't seem to remember anything at all, and later on, he bade her goodbye, only to return to the magic analysis room using a secret spell. He then used the ancient magic analysis and combined it with modern magic to find some results, and then he decided to return the next day. But on his way out, he bumped into some dude whose magical presence couldn't be felt and who introduced himself as Katsuki from the strongest class in the academy. 4. He claimed not to be an elite, unlike the others, but asked to confirm if Asuma was colorless. Katsuki extended his hand towards him, saying everyone was the same at the academy, regardless, and then shook him, asking him to take care of him. However, Azuma immediately felt a very strong, dark form of magic, wondering what sort of magic the guy was using and why he'd be casually using modern magic in a public space, being so impolite. Anyway, as Katsuki left, Azuma noticed that the guy's magic color was white, and he let out a devious, mischievous smile. In a flashback, Asuma recalled how ancient magic was only used by a chosen few, and those who lacked the talent for magic couldn't refine mana within their bodies. However, in this present era, things seemed largely different because the mana slots and their respective execution sets had been replaced by an organ called the magic circuit, using the laser stick known as the smart rod that all the ladies were dying for. Thanks to this device, mana could be automatically injected into the body's magical circuit, and magic circles were artificially generated to activate magic. The process had made it easier for individuals without magic to access magic, just like the talented ones, and as a result, it had weakened modern magic against the powerful ancient magic, not to mention how impossible it'd be to use magic without smart rods. Anyway, Asuma found this glitch in the Matrix to be a perfect opportunity for him to develop hybrid magic, a combination of ancient and modern magic. To achieve this, he'd have to master modern magic to the highest level and conquer all the attributes, and he had a quantum computer to help him calculate the theory for the hypothesis of his hybrid magic. While waiting for the results, he headed out for a drink, but right before him, a magical window gradually opened up in the dark, and a sudden gush of power hit him. Immediately, he recognized that it was from Katsuki, whom he recognized as Izaya, one of his subordinates from the past who had betrayed him. Anyway, Asuma currently felt like he was in the sky, even though he knew it was just a recognition-altering spell that created such an illusion, and something so typical of Izaya's form of magic. Right now, Asuma was still falling through the sky and wondered what could happen next until he saw some bat-like creatures flying towards him, which were familiars created by Izaya. Asuma used his barriers to protect himself, but because he couldn't just keep defending, he had to pinpoint Izaya's current location. He started by using deceleration magic to stop the falling effect he was experiencing. But then again, some spike balls were suddenly up in the sky with him, and there was a magic lightning strike accompanying them. Asuma noticed that this happened because he tried using the deceleration magic, and in fact, anytime he cast a counterspell, it triggered an intercepting spell against his own spell. He was frustrated already because he had very little time to get rid of the lightning before it'd explode, and there wasn't even time for him to use deceleration magic. Soon, one of the bombs came really close to his face, and there was a massive explosion, after which he found himself floating in space with no oxygen. On the other hand, Izaya, who was behind all of this, was smiling devilishly because he had sent a fiery comet towards Asuma, who was already tired of dealing with one attack after the other. It was now time to repel the attacks, so again, he summoned his magical barrier and protected himself from the exploding fireball that was only inches away from him. Thereafter, he told Izaya that he'd received his message loud and clear, and it was now his turn to demonstrate his power, after intercepting the attack, which was super easy to intercept. By the way, Asuma's mind was drawn back to the fact that the atmosphere he was in lacked oxygen, and if he stayed there any longer, he'd eventually die from suffocation, but not by his sugar mummy's airbags. Despite that, he couldn't help but admire the remarkable precision with which the magical space was constructed and how artistic the entire place looked, thanks to Izaya's obsession with aesthetics. Anyway, this was also going to be Izaya's downfall, because he had a peculiar flaw that involved him wishing to see Asuma's death with his own eyes, and that meant his beautiful world wasn't being automatically operated, but rather, that Izaya was nearby using a peephole of the sort to observe Asuma. Now, all that Asuma needed to do was find that point of weakness and attack Izaya from there, so he kept letting his body fall deeper into the darkness. This was very annoying for Izaya, who was confused and asked why Asuma had suddenly stopped resisting, but his surprise didn't prevent him from launching even more attacks on Asuma and completely ignoring his defenseless state. What he didn't know was that Asuma was planning to release all his concentrated mana gathered by meditation from all his mana and execution slots, all at the same time, by expanding. Right before Isaya's bewildered eyes, he watched as Asuma's magical circle expanded and even encapsulated Isaya's comets. Using that magical circle, Asuma planned to analyze the atmosphere and notice the oddities that would help him locate his opponent's surveillance point. He remained calm even when more comets were coming for him at high speed, and finally, in the darkness, a bright star gave away Isaya's position. So Asuma immediately reached out through the barrier and magically caused everything to disintegrate. Thereafter, he found himself back in school and proved that indeed it was a recognition-altering magic that Isaya had used. And then out the window, he jumped out to find the guy calmly chilling on another rooftop. Isaya looked so innocent, unlike you. But Asuma still called him out on his BS and pointed out that Isaya had cast a magic spell on him. However, the guy remained quiet and still said nothing, even when Asuma asked him why he'd been after his life, even after being the one to say that they should get along. But quite unexpectedly, Isaya jumped down and, with bright eyes, said Asuma was exactly as he'd imagined. This took Asuma by surprise, and Isaya continued, saying that the way Asuma broke through his illusion magic using his chantless levitation magic was undoubtedly impressive and made him the best magician ever. Isaya was also excited to discover that anyone at all could use magic in such an impressive manner, and he found it a beautiful sight to behold. Again, he remained impressed with Asuma's disintegration magic, so he asked him to tell him the logic behind his magical circuit, although what he wanted to see most importantly was the sight of something truly beautiful falling to pieces. At the same time, the trickster had cast another spell and created another magical realm with just himself and Asuma in it. Next, he used a modern magical spell known as the Meteor Fall, and some sharp materials from nearby started flying towards Asuma. So again he started dodging them and casting protection barriers as he escaped. But something took him by surprise, and he got hit by one of the sharp meteors. However, that was just a brief vision of his death, if he wasn't careful. So Asuma quickly activated a barrier right above his head, blocking the weapons that would have taken him out, and got out of that world. Now, Isaya was blushing like an idiot and wondering just how long Asuma could last. So he damaged the nearby power grid to set some live wires loose, and one of them was directed towards Asuma. Before long, Asuma got the whole point of these consecutive attacks was to push him into a tough spot with no escape and then corner him there. He had nothing to defend himself except for his magical barriers, which were already getting weak and failing to protect him from some of the attacks. When Isaya noticed this, he was overjoyed that Asuma was already reaching his limits so soon. He looked at the sky, and Asuma did the same. Then he saw an airplane descending towards his head, along with more of Isaya's relentless meteor showers, which he was so full of himself for. But right before he sent another attack, Asuma spotted him with a needle and immediately nullified its effects. Apparently, that was supposed to cancel the magic that was meant to block a jumbo jet passenger plane, and instead, Asuma made it explode mid-air, sending its pieces flying in all directions and returning the scene back to normal. With this, he confirmed that all he was experiencing was just a phantom ill, and then he snatched the magical needle from Isaya's hands. The fool was shocked that Asuma had discovered his concealed needle, which he was using to create the illusions, although Asuma contended that he had indeed uncovered Isaya's schemes. To begin with, the falling debris magic he cast was only a decoy, and after dropping real objects in the form of live wires and metal sheets, Isaya created the illusion of a falling plane to distract Asuma. All of this was so he could launch his magic needle imbued with unconsciousness spells, and that was his primary goal. In fact, the sophisticated name he gave his attack, namely Meteor Fall, wasn't anything but a cheap bluff. But it was still all impressive, even though such low-budget attacks wouldn't even scratch Asuma. Isaya was still in disbelief at the fact that Asuma could detect his magic, because there was no mage alive who could detect his magic activation. He so deluded himself and refused to believe Asuma was the great hero from 3,000 years ago, who was the only one to predict his movements. But Asuma explained in detail how he could tell what Isaya was planning and how he'd finish the attack. He appeared right in front of the terrified guy and told him that he had made only one mistake, which gave him away so easily, which was that he used so much magic in front of Asuma and granted him the opportunity and time to properly analyze it. With that, Asuma pushed against Isaya's chest and created a magical circle on it, which was so beautiful and appealing to the fool. Anyway, Asuma's magic was so intense that the ground beneath them cracked, and Izaya fell unconscious, marking Asuma's undeniable victory. Years back, in the capital of the magical city of Grand Gaya, Izaya was painting on a canvas when Asuma stopped by to appreciate his good work. They were later interrupted by Kiryu and Miyun, who were arguing playfully, but Izaya wasn't in their mood and walked away, but not before thanking Asuma for showering him with praise and even offering to paint his portrait. On his way in, Kiryu muttered some side talk, and Inaya remembered why he hated them so much was because they never appreciated those preschool doodles he called art, unlike the great mage, Asuma. In the palace, he bumped into one of his colleagues, Siwon, who looked distressed, so he asked what was up, only to find that Siwon was summoned by the king and given an imperial command, which he whispered into Izaya's ears. When he learned what the king had commanded, Izaya was horrified to hear that Asuma was plotting a rebellion, and even though he found it impossible to believe, Simon insisted that the rumor was true because the king's future sight ability was true and absolute. Izaya was still mortified and full of questions, wondering why Asuma would want to destroy the beautiful city of Grand Gaya. But before he could find the answers to his million questions, Izaya woke up in the infirmary of his school and had a throbbing headache as he realized that it was all a nightmare he had had. But someone offered him a drink, and he was shocked to see Azuma seated right beside him, saying he was groaning terribly. The drink he was offering Inaya contained electrolytes and sugar to help him replenish the fluids he lost through his sweat. But Izaya was just surprised and wondered why Asuma was helping him at all. And Azuma simply said Izaya couldn't have escaped unhurt after receiving a direct impact of his magic. Thankfully, Izaya's magic circuits were functioning normally, so it seems the attack didn't lead to anything seriously damaging. At the same time, Izaya's eyes were drawn to the towel in Asuma's hands, which was soaked and showed signs of wiping, so it was obvious Asuma had been taking care of him the whole time. To this, Asuma responded that he wouldn't want to lose a skilled mage, and this reminded Izaya of Asuma, the legendary hero of 3,000 years ago. Izaya thanked his hero and received the water bottle from him, while pleading with him to understand that not everyone in Sphere was like Kiryu. Obviously, the guy had exceptional magical abilities, but Izaya just didn't agree with his way of thinking, and the only reason he approached Asuma was to see the strength of the person who defeated Kiryu. In that light, Izaya bowed, apologizing for Kiryu's stupidity and how he'd been maltreating Asuma and trying to exclude him from the academy. Asuma, on the other hand, acknowledged that Izaya wasn't really a bad person, so he'd forget all about the fact that Izaya ambushed him if he agreed to strike a deal with him. The condition was that Inaya should leave Sphere and stay with Asuma at the academy, so they could create a new faction. This was obviously surprising to Izaya, but Asuma had his reasons for trusting the boy, and it was because the Izaya in front of him didn't have memories from 3,000 years ago, and Asuma needed allies to accomplish his ultimate goal with him. Without even flinching, Izaya stepped out of bed and bowed to Asuma, submitting to his will wholeheartedly. As he proclaimed his loyalty to Asuma, Izaya felt strange within because it seemed he'd done something similar in the past. But his rainbow memories were interrupted when he caught the school nurse snooping, and he turned to leave. But before that, he handed the nurse a chart of Izaya's analyzed magic circuit so she'd use it as a reference. The lady was shocked and completely flabbergasted to find that the report was detailed to a T, so she asked Inaya to be her sugar boy under the guise of a special student helping in the lab. But with his unmatched aura, Dude told her he wasn't into saggy sheiks like herself for the time being. Later, he went back to the magic analysis room and found that his results had successfully loaded, which stated that his theory had established a new magic system, which he was then advised to present at a conference. It was good news because Asuma could now take the next step in establishing his theory by arranging the magic formulas according to their objectives, adapting them to the magic circuit, and getting a precise verification system. Most of all, he was going to make his haters boil to the core by inventing his own basic magic. The next day, it seemed Asuma was already shocking his teachers with his improved performance, and some even thought he was cheating, but it was certainly impossible for him to cheat during oral exams. In the course of lectures, one of the teachers asked if anyone in the class could unravel a modern magic equation, and when he spotted Asuma, he called him an idiot whose ick was the same as his age and was pretty sure Asuma would be unable to solve it. But to his utmost shock and that of Asuma's classmates, the guy showed them that his 2 brain cells were better than their entire brains combined, including the teacher. Over and over again, Asuma made his teacher look like a worthless fool and shocked him with his brilliance, until the man got fed up and sent Asuma back to his seat. Some of his classmates were pretty convinced that Asuma was using a hacked version of ChatGPT, because the problems he was so easily solving were for postgraduate level students. Meanwhile, Asuma was just wondering about how he had to reapply for the magic analysis room. But after the break, everyone in class flooded Riri with requests, asking her to help them gain Asuma's favor so they could get closer to him. When he showed up, their eyes were lit like hopeless puppies, so she agreed to ask him on their behalf and begged that if he was free later on, they could all hang out at a cafe. Surprisingly, he smiled and said it was fine by him, so the entire class erupted in celebration. Meanwhile, some creep peeping on Asuma from outside was just being bitter at him for no reason and threatened to turn his handsome face into one as hideous as hers. Later at the cafe, Asuma was getting bombarded with dumb questions from his moronic classmates, and one in particular asked him who he was closest to in the class. He smiled nicely for a moment and then began to answer other people's questions, but that guy was persistent and insisted that Asuma answer his question. Without batting an eyelid, he said that the classmate he was close to was Riri, and the moment he said this, the girl turned all shades of red while her classmates cheered them on. However, she immediately recollected herself, knowing that Asuma could say something but mean it differently, and so she decided not to fall for his words anymore, like the first time. Moments later, she calmed down, realized she had hurt her hand because she spilled hot chocolate all over it, and tried to process her emotions over Asuma. He apologized to her for getting her burned, but was interrupted by the other classmate, who said they'd differentiate in pharmacology so Asuma could have what he desired. They also called him a NEET, which stood for something dumb, the teacher said, meaning not in education, employment, or training. For the rest of the meeting, those fools kept simping for him, and as they returned home, the guys were jubilant and glad that they were now friends with Asuma. But someone around the corner had been following them and informed another person about their location. Mercifully, Asuma's senses were sharpened, and he picked up on what was going on, so he asked to keep quiet, and just as he suspected, an entire gang of boys was following him. He asked them what they wanted, but they said nothing at all, and when a vehicle arrived behind him, the boys made way in the center, and one of them opened the door for some guy to step out. When Asuma's classmates recognized him as one of the students from S4, they were jittery and almost shat their pants, while the guy walked up to Asuma to confirm his identity. He introduced himself as Sakane, the president of the club federation at their school, but his presence alone gave away his identity as C1. He acknowledged that he'd been too dependent on Izaya and hence had come to challenge Asuma to a magical duel. The announcement took everyone by surprise, but Asuma was absolutely called on to explain what it meant, so he turned to Riri. The girl took her to explain it to him, and C1, who was growing impatient, said Asuma had better accept it because he'd grown tired of seeing the guy doing as he wished and making the academy happy. With that, he positioned himself to draw out his sword, but the moment even a glimpse of it was caught by Asuma, he realized that this wasn't just a harmless duel, but rather a murderous intent with extreme pressure. Unfortunately, this intent wasn't only directed towards Asuma, but to his poor classmates as well, with the intention of taking them as hostages, especially if Asuma refused to avert the duel. Asuma had a brief flashback of himself back in the day with C1, watching him physically train himself and master techniques other than magic. Regardless of anything, Asuma accepted the duel, and C1 sheathed his sword, giving the time and venue of the duel. As he turned his back, Asuma knew it was way too early for the guy to be challenging him, and that he'd have to get ready to receive the full thickness of his flesh. Later that night, Asuma was sleeping soundly when he experienced a lucid dream, a dream where someone is aware they're dreaming. He had learned about this concept during a lesson in class where he was told that one could deeply access the subconscious and late memories while dreaming. This sounded like a perfect idea, and so he took a deep dive into the memories of his body's original owner. When Asuma initially reincarnated, there was a small trace of unused mana left in the body's magic circuit. He hadn't touched it as well, and left it within him because that mana carried traces of how it flowed through the original owner's body, and essentially, what that meant was that the thoughts of the original owner should remain. The plan right now was for Asuma to use magic and salvage the boy's consciousness, but his greatest obstacle was that the spell for such a task didn't exist in any ancient magic records, so he'd have to develop one in that moment right there. To achieve this, he would employ skills from mental manipulation and hypnotic suggestion in some weird ratio, and then he would construct a new theory, design a magical circle for activation, and weave the new magic spell, which he'd finally cast himself. For Asuma, inventing new magic in a mental space and within a dream might be one achievement only he could achieve in the entire world. so he was fully confident in his abilities. He began the process and was finally facing the soul of the original body's owner, Shiobana, who was initially unconscious and in a deep sleep but woke up to see Azuma. The poor boy was shocked, and while Asuma was glad that the salvage was successful, all Shiobana wanted to know was who he really was. At the same time, something strange began to happen, and Shiobana suddenly fell to the ground because the synchronization process between his consciousness and the body's memories had begun. It was then that it occurred to Shiobana that he had attempted to take his life in his room and lost consciousness, was taken to the hospital, where he fell into a coma never to wake again, and so was the plan. He obviously wasn't happy to be alive again, but Asuma calmed him down, saying he was currently borrowing his body and apologizing for doing so without his permission. But Shiobana was at peace with it because it was a much better option than remaining a vegetable for the rest of his life. Still, he was curious, wondering why someone from 3,000 years ago with a pretty degree would reincarnate into the body of an ugly wimp. A few moments later, the boy was shocked to discover that Asuma had defeated Kiryu out of his bullies and Professor George, the strongest teacher in the academy, both of whom were being malicious to him. He also found out about Isaiah's defeat and was turning purple when he learned that Azuma was going to have a duel with yet another S4 member, all because they were malicious to Shiobana. He was already running crazy at the fact that a loser like himself was drawing way too much attention at the academy, but he calmed down and said it didn't matter much to him anyway, since he was already dead. And as for the reason why someone like Asuma from 3,000 years ago was in his body, Shiobana had already figured out the reason in a dream he had when he was in a coma. In that dream, he was floating in pitch black darkness, and there was a meteorite shower nearby. The meteors, we are being drawn into a massive black hole, one after the other, and in the midst of it all, there was light that caught his attention and had been flickering. At that moment, Shiobana was struggling desperately and thought to himself that if Asuma strongly didn't want to be pulled in by that darkness, he would take his place. The summary of this was that Shiobana was a failure who wanted to die but continued living, while Azuma was a man who wanted to live but was dying. In the end, Shiobana was glad that Azuma became the owner of the body instead of him because he felt that's what was supposed to happen all along. However, Asuma said he was wrong, and that was not true, because both men were of one mind and body, and without either of them, their current state would not exist, meaning that their stories were now intertwined into one. Azuma promised to make all of Shiobana's dreams come true, and the boy couldn't help but burst into tears as they both began a new partnership. Hearing that Asuma was planning to make all his wishes come true made Shiobana really happy, but he wanted to help if there was any way he could, given that Asuma was the legendary great mage from 3,000 years ago and probably wouldn't need him. However, Asuma said he needed his help with a chant that Riri had made at the counter when placing their order, and that he wanted to understand and analyze it. Shiobana giggled and offered to do it gladly, but suddenly he started fading from the bottom upwards, and Asuma said it was already time for him to wake up from the dream. Before then, Shiobana thanked Asuma for bringing him back to life and promised that from now on, he'd be peeking into their story. Asuma did the same, and they both gradually faded away, although Asuma held on and made a personal promise to fulfill Shiobana's lingering wishes because he had failed to keep those promises 3,000 years ago. Meanwhile, at Shin's home, he was softly meditating and drawing strength from a huge crystal-like object in front of him. It was known as the Ulzate Nitride Orichalcum, which was a rare metal mined only in his family's long-held mines and was the hardest metal on Earth. He emptied his mind to nothingness and suddenly went crazy as he drew out his sword and slashed it against the metal's body repeatedly. Somehow, Dude cut the hardest thing on Earth into pieces and had a look of satisfaction and accomplishment afterwards. However, he says someone's presence and tried to find Mizu sitting in the courtyard, so he reminded her that he had warned her not to come in there. The girl stared at him with her crazy eyes and mentioned some properties of the metal he just destroyed, starting from its toughness, which was 30 times that of diamonds with a man of conductivity 100 times that of iridium, and its being the most important rare metal for manufacturing the 17th generation smart rod. To her, he was just being a lunatic for using such a powerful piece of metal as a test target. Anyway, he told her that he had already watched a certain video she sent him and that he couldn't believe that Kiryu and Izaya were defeated. It was initially hard to believe, because both guys had a certain level of respect when it comes to strength and were the representatives of prestige in their academy. This fight was personal for Shen because he cared about the academy's prestige and was certainly not going to show mercy to anyone who threatened it. The lady said she shouldn't be underestimated simply because she was devoid of an attribute, because he would regret it just like those two. Shin shared that using his magic swordsman's secret techniques, he would crush anyone in a duel and wouldn't mind if any accident happened because the Academy's authority was more important than human life. Backing him up, Mizu added that she would give Asuma a much-needed reverse plastic surgery, but she also asked him if a certain person would be joining them, and he said that was impossible. He immediately had a flashback, taking him 3,000 years back when he was training one day and was met by Asuma, who recognized that he had created a new magic to unlock a person's lightened abilities to increase the capacity for mana by about tenfold. However, Shin warned that there was a side effect to beware of, which involved the caster's aggressive tendencies manifesting outwardly. Away from his flashback, Shin was finally prepared for his magical duel, so he set out of his home. A brief background about magic duels in the Academy. They were officially recognized at the Magic Training Institution and were essentially battles between students using magic as the premise. The outcome of such magic duels determined the ranking of students, and higher-ranked students would receive various privileges within the Academy. The scene showed Riri educating Asuma on the entire process of magic duels, although she felt he must have known all of it already because every student did. However, he said it was his very first time hearing of it and thanked her for telling him. But she was so concerned for him, wondering if his memory confusion was still persisting. And if that was the case, then she would have to support him all the way through. However, with the way things were going, she was somehow of the opinion that this guy was treating her specially. He interrupted her thoughts with an unexpected backshot, and then asked her to pick a tie for him. She picked one, and Asuma asked her if a student could have increased usage time for the magic analysis room if they increased their rank. She strongly affirmed this to be true and asked if that was what really bothered him, as he said that it certainly was the most important thing to him. He also brought up that Shin called him a harmful presence to the Academy, and it seemed that the situation was worse than that. Riri showed him the Academy newspaper, and he saw the headlines of his duel against Shin, where Asuma was referred to as a talentless swine. It was also said that the club union president would mete out punishment to students who threatened the Academy. Seeing this, Asuma accepted his fate, because Shin was a master of Japanese magic swordsmanship and an heir to a mine producing rare metals for the smart rod. In that light, he's made donations in the billions to the Academy, and obviously no one could go against him. Riri also agreed that no matter how innocent Asuma was, Shin would always be more righteous to the public. On a lighter note, he asked her if he loved her enough to be her zaddy, and she said she was almost blinded by his aura. Now, it was time to head to the duel, but on his way, Asuma met Izaya, who whispered something in his ears right before walking off with a smile. At the arena, students were present in their numbers, cheering for C1 and hoping he'd just trash Asuma within seconds. Both guys came face to face with each other, and C1 acknowledged Asuma's courage for showing up and not running away. Asuma thanked him, but C1 asked him who exactly he was, almost as if he knew Asuma was the reincarnated hero from 3,000 years ago. C1 added that he felt it was no coincidence that a lowlife like Asuma would defeat 2S4 students, and that was exactly why he wanted to know who Asuma was. He was only pointing at Asuma with his bare fingers, but the intensity of power released was so much that it almost blinded the audience. But Asuma simply said he was Shiobana Asuma, nothing more or less. He stared squarely at C1 with not a single iota of fear in his eyes, and it was obvious that all of that was getting to his opponent. So C1 just snickered, saying he didn't care who Asuma was and wouldn't underestimate him either, but rather challenge him with resolve and crush him with all his might. Asuma smiled because that was exactly what he wanted, and he promised not to show any mercy to his opponent either. With that, the battle line was drawn, and the battle was about to begin in earnest. Just before the referee officially commenced the magical duel, C1 halted the process and told him to hold up for a minute. There, he told Asuma that while he intended to crush him into nothing, he was equally prepared to show him mercy as well, as that was the pride of his noble family. If Asuma would just submit his withdrawal form and agree to be C1's onloofen, C1 said he'd graciously consider the duel forfeited on his part, and in that way, Asuma could avoid unnecessary pain. However, Asuma directed his own question to the referee, asking how many ranks he would be increased by if he won the match. The man treated him like a lost cause, but still explained that C1 was an S rank who was equally ranked first, while Asuma was an F-ranked student who was ranked at 1200. Essentially speaking, if Asuma miraculously won the match, his rank would be boosted to A, so Asuma asked C1 to raise his student rank to S. and he would immediately concede defeat to him without causing the guy to feel any pain. Asuma's guys really ticked C1 off, and he was so mad that the entire audience could feel his rage from their seats. He furiously said it had been a long time since he had seen such a fool who didn't know their place, and at that point, even if Asuma cried and groveled on his knees, he would never forgive him and would crush him completely. Azuma told him to go ahead and try if he could, and then C1 ordered the referee to commence the match. Before anything began, Asuma reminded himself that he was up against the reincarnated version of C1, and if he held back anything at all, there was a significant chance of him losing. To prevent that, he planned to use ancient magic at full power from the very beginning, and so he started by creating a magic circle designed with so much weird stuff that no one cares about. But even that trashy stuff seemed to excite the boring audience because that was the first time they were ever seeing it. From the circle, Azuma directed an attack towards C1, but the guy immediately countered it by using blocks of cement. This was impressive because someone wasn't even trying and had an automatic counterattack magical ability and had already cut magical sand across the entire arena. This was expected and befitting of C1, who was previously named C1 of Earth. On the other hand, C1 confirmed what the reports had said about Asuma, which was that he was using an unknown form of magic. But then C1 was confident that the attack had nothing on him and he could easily end the battle with a single strike. The moment he gradually drew his sword, Asuma immediately knew something was up. His opponent's weapon was one that combined a smart rod and a physical weapon, all in one, which was infused with battle aura along with his earth attribute barrier magic. This served as a warning to Asuma, who knew that if he dared attack in that moment, the attack would be automatically countered, and C1 could retaliate with a dead attack. Seeing C1 in this new state known as absolute space, Asuma was more challenged than ever before to destroy it. His opponent, on the other hand, seemed to be an irregularity in their prestigious academy, who had come to disrupt harmony. He wasn't about to let us get away with it because all the days of accumulator training discipline and forging of the spirit were what created true strength in a magic swordsman. As such, there was no way some filth lacking any form of attribute could stop his sword just like that. Simply judging from his positioning, the audience was already hyped, knowing that their favorite was going to put an end to Azuma within the next few seconds using his finishing sword technique that had been passed down generations. Before Asuma knew it, the ground beneath him slowly cracked and magical earth hands started drawing him into the ground before he could do anything. His ability to escape had been sealed, and his opponent was about to chop his head off in one clear slice. The guy started a dramatic crescent moon dance that made him look like he had roaches in his underwear. The evil witch, Mizu, was sure that this was the end for Asuma because C1's slash could cut the hardest metal in the world, and there was hence no hope for Asuma. As the slashes approached him, Asuma quickly untied his tie and flung it in the air, after which he used ancient hardening magic to transform its upper end into a sword. With his new weapon, he countered C1's powerful slash and sent the hit into shock, as well as the audience. Also, to get rid of the earth hands that had been holding him down, he simply chanted an ancient spell of annihilation magic known as the Particle Veil. In no time he was set free and had equally started disappearing, much to his opponent's shock. But what the guy didn't know was that Asuma had just started and was about to launch his own counterattack. Now that he was invisible, it was impossible for C1 to easily swing his sword at him, so he placed it back in its sheath, swearing that the next time it appeared, it would be his end because the absolute space was an invincible barrier. What he didn't know was that the boy was right behind him with his sword, and moments before C1's instinct kicked in, Azuma sliced the barrier down, shattering it into pieces, although a mighty hand grabbed his sword from him. C1 was convinced that he had finally gotten a hold of Asuma because he could grab his sword, so the boy let go of the sword, and while his opponent used his own weapon repeatedly against him, Asuma dodged all the attacks, remaining invisible. Seeing that Asuma was willing to let go of his sword, C1 told him he might as well have placed his head on the chopping board with his own hands. So many earth hands were reaching out for Azuma at the same time, but he activated his magical circle and caused them all to disintegrate, and then he let go of his sword, or better still, his necktie. Quickly, C1 slashed in the direction of the necktie but missed Azuma by inches, and the moment Azuma's necktie got into his hands again, it had transformed into a sword, which he used to block C1's sword in his now visible form. Asuma said he was going to settle the match with that final strike, but C1 was so good and impressive. In response, C1 said Asuma was the first guy to chase him so far into his domain, but he'd used the secret sword to break through. Right before Azuma's eyes, C1 shouted the command, "Magic Sword, Full Moon of Organs." The effect was a bright, blinding light coming from behind C1, which impaired Asuma's vision for a while, granting C1 the opportunity to tow a sword right straight towards Asuma's chest. The sword ran straight through to the back with an explosive force, and C1 said the command, "Moon Crater Bomb," which blasted an explosion, causing a hole right in Asuma's chest. He fell to his death, and all his friends were dismayed to see him in that pathetic state. So C1 ordered the referee to confirm Asuma's death, and the guy walked over to his body, while C1 stated that he would humbly accept the punishment for committing involuntary manslaughter. However, as the referee drew nearer, Asuma's hands shook, and the guy slowly resurrected from death, with the hole in his chest fully healed. This was shocking, especially to C1, because he had used his most powerful trick in the book, and that should have been fatal to anyone. As soon as he spoke, first saying he was completely wrong for thinking he was putting in his best effort and had been rather underestimating C1 unconsciously, but now he realized that his real opponent was the infamous Earth C1. The entire arena was struck at Asuma's resurrection, but for him, this was the beginning of the battle for real. C1 was still deluded, thinking his secret technique would work if he applied it the second time, so he took a stance and warned Asuma that he was about to bring him down. Meanwhile, Asuma was worried about his current body because although it had exceptional mana adaptability, it lacked stamina, and the damage he took from C1's attack was significant, so he had to avoid prolonging the fight and resolve it swiftly. He employed a multiple magical circle technique, which in ancient magic studies was known as the magical essence body and in modern magical interpretation was the Magi circuit. How it worked was that he was rapidly condensing the matter contained within it, compressing it to the threshold limit, circulating the mana through the body at high speed and temporarily enhancing physical abilities. While this was going on, C1 was busy shivering and pissing his pants, and he was lucky because this was even Azuma's first attempt. For Azuma, he was enjoying the best of both worlds because having a strong opponent like C1 was providing the best environment for him to construct theories and conduct experiments simultaneously. While he was distracted, C1 immediately jumped into action when he found what he thought was an opening, and was pretty sure he was about to end Asuma on the spot. But to his greatest shock, the guy dodged the attack in milliseconds with a swiftness that even C1 could not comprehend. However, C1 still found an opening and instead used his hands to hold his legs and prevent him from moving around. But even more surprisingly, Asuma grabbed the hand that had been holding him down and revealed that it was a robot, which he spun around repeatedly and sent flying straight into the audience, where it was reduced to nothing. Now that his pleasure robots were down, C1 was depressed and dazed, while Asuma approached him with alpha male energy. For the first time, C1 doubted himself because he was the supposed representative of the Japanese Magic Swordsmanship Association, yet here he was getting his buns served to him by an absolute loser. This gave him a flashback to 3,000 years ago when he was Asuma's subordinate and had just told him about his new technology with aggressive side effects, which still required further refinement but had gotten to a point where human trials could be considered. Then, Esme was concerned about how risky the experiment could be and asked him about the candidates for the trials, but C1 said he had someone in mind, a highly capable test subject who wouldn't complain. With that, the conversation came to an end and C1 was back in the present, suddenly going through his first milk release. It seemed his person from thousands of years ago had finally caught up with him, and he was begging his aggressive form not to come out of him but failed to prevent him from doing so. His glasses shattered and fell to the floor, and eventually, it seemed like he was a brand new person. C1 burst out in an evil laughter with his body exuding 1,000,000 times the mana he previously had, so much that even Asuma could feel it. The moment Mizu saw this, the evil witch was excited that the real C1 had come out. Meanwhile, Asuma realized that he probably was the test subject all along. C1 had gotten into his manic state and was now threatening to chop up everyone in the arena. So he flew towards them and decided to start with Asuma, who was certainly not prepared for the extent of speed C1 used to attack him. C1 wildly chopped through the ground slabs until he landed a fat slice on Asuma's knee and wasn't even letting him catch his breath between attacks. All the while, C1's improved fighting form impressed Asuma, and he was glad to see C1 from the past use his powers. He, however, noticed that both guys were seemingly at their limits, and perhaps his own past life's abilities could be reviving soon. All the while, C1 was going crazy on Asuma and had finally trapped him in a corner, right in front of the watching credit. The students noticed that they could serve as collateral damage from the fight, so they got up and took to their heels. Asuma finally understood that C1 had been calculated even in his seemingly random attacks, and now he could use his ultimate attack, the Crescent Moon Slash. Asuma wasn't about to take such an attack head-on because it involved him getting slashed multiple times within a short time frame. Now, even though Asuma couldn't predict with precision what could happen, C1 was 10,000 years too early and had already revealed his ultimate technique. Sometime in the middle of the fight, Asuma found an opening to create a magical array that formed giant 3D lenses all around him. The first strike of the calamity would touch the giant lens, and this lens settled by Esme was not just an ancient analysis magic because it didn't just automatically analyze the objects it touched, but directly transmitted the extracted information to Asuma, who then processed it with his brain at the speed of light. This meant that even if Asuma's opponent possessed a refined system that could predict the future, it couldn't match the speed of light for any reason, and Asuma's brain processed everything was about 0.1 seconds, which was just as long he'd last with his first. During this short while, C1 was using all he had in an attempt to shred Asuma into pieces. But when Asuma was out of his state, he was just as quick as C1's slashes and repeatedly blocked them with his bare hands. And since he knew the final slash of the 100 slashes would most likely be a slash right down by C1 himself, he waited until the guy moved his sword for the final move and then held the blade in his hands, snapping the sword into two with only his 2 fingers. At this point, C1 was confused and speechless, so the moment he had disarmed him and left him on the floor, Asuma packed all his frustrations into one punch and delivered it to C1's cheeks, and then he pointed the broken end of the sword at his eyes. This time, C1 could see the hero he betrayed 3,000 years ago, who was now telling him to surrender or lose his eyes right there and then. C1 suddenly lost his confidence and looked like a chicken about to be slaughtered and fearing his imminent death. At the end, he surrendered, and the whole crowd erupted in celebration, while Asuma victoriously asked him if he had now realized his place. After, C1 asked Asuma how he was able to predict all his ultimate moves, because it was humanly impossible for anyone's brain to keep up. Asuma told him that in the Academy's magic analysis room, there was a device called a quantum computer, and by applying its principles and circulating magic to boost it, Asuma applied it to his brain. As crazy as it sounded to C1, Asuma really did recreate the calculations of a quantum computer inside his brain and had made it compatible with his ancient magic. All of this was thanks to Isaiah, who had earlier whispered in Asuma's ears that C1 was planning to develop an alternate aggressive personality during the battle, and that Asuma shouldn't relent until he had completely broken that aspect of C1's personality. The fool was still in denial of the truth because he only regarded Asuma as a worthless, untalented magician. However, Asuma reminded him that he wasn't just any magician, and he was a grand magus. Thiefter, the whole school rejoiced and celebrated Asuma's victory, while haters like Kiryan and Mizu were slowly getting chewed up from within and had to walk out for their sanity. Later, no one could stop talking about how a loser like Asuma had defeated the school's top-ranked council president in a magic duel, and how it was a battle that won't die down anytime soon. Now, Asuma had rapidly risen from being in the 1000th position to taking 23rd place in the student ranking in the academy. He checked to see the special privileges for students ranked in class and saw that he'd get a ton of benefits, in addition to the expansion of usage rights for the magic analysis room, which was his very aim from the start. Now that he had that, it would be more possible for him to analyze the flow of time of the quantum computer. Already, he'd established the theory of hybrid magic combining ancient magic and modern magic, so the next step was designing a framework that'd let his theories stand the test of time, and this was something he couldn't wait to achieve. The next day, Asuma was chilling at home, realizing it had only been a week since his reincarnation, yet he'd already deeply understood modern society. Using a combination of this understanding in addition to that of his ancient classes, he could now analyze the Earth's history. Firstly, it seemed there was some disruption in cultural continuity between 3,000 years back when he was alive and now in his reincarnated state, meaning that some things were passed down from those ancient times, while others were not. The cause of this discontinuity was attributed to an event known as the collapse, during which science also regressed and essentially, the world had stopped evolving. However, now, the ancient magic that was supposed to disappear was now working with science, which had now made modern magic accessible to everyone instead of just the talented. Now, the kingdom of Grand Gaia that had previously betrayed him had already been destroyed long ago. However, with Asuma being reincarnated into this time of the present and having seen his colleagues, Kiryo, Isaiah, and C1, he knew it was certain that Miyun was somewhere in that academy. However, that wasn't the most pressing issue, as there was also a possibility that the king who ordered his death was also alive in the present era. Just then, he received a report about some magic incense burner production, and was so glad to see that his invention was still in use even in the present era. He found a notebook, but couldn't read its contents because they were scribbled over, so he used a removal spell and realized that it was Shiobana's bucket list. He smiled, realizing that the guy had potential all along, but also realized that the most important things to Shiobana in his lifetime were to make friends, meet his estranged family, and become a hero that protected everyone. Really, all Shiobana wanted was vengeance and to meet his family. But that was new for Asuma, their hero, who'd never understood what it felt like having a family. The next day, Asuma showed up at school, and rumors were flying about how he became so hot overnight and even defeated some of the powerful S4 members. On the way, Asuma asked Izaya about the steps he'd taken to leave S4, and Izaya told him he'd already submitted the request to leave S4 and join Azuma to begin his own faction. However, they were interrupted by the sudden appearance of gossip girls who were making a story on Azuma and asking how he became such an overnight sensation, in addition to the fact that the ladies all wanted his smart rod. But Azuma and Izaya weren't in the mood for the laddies and their shenanigans, so before they knew it, the guys took off and left them interviewing themselves. Later, Azuma got to class, although some invisible lady had been following him without his knowledge. But just as he settled in his seat, the journalists ambushed him again, and he had to turn down their request for an interview. However, the ladies refused to take no for an answer and planted themselves in the seats next to him, and Asuma told him that they'd have to go through Riri, who was now his secretary. She stood in for him and told them to schedule an appointment after school, and then the ladies calmed the heck down. For helping him, Asuma told Riri he'd make it up to her in the boys' bathroom later that day. But he still couldn't get over how his fame was getting in the way of his quality of life, so he decided to secure a private space on campus. While he was deep in thought, Riri wondered when she'd ever leave the friend zone and whether Azuma had a crush on someone. Later during swimming classes, the students were cheering some dude who seemed to have the fishes running for their money and had set a new record for the fastest time to swim without using magic. Of course, that was Azuma again, who had somehow pleased the god of Riz and gotten so much of it that he couldn't help being so fly at everything. He later went to shower, but surprisingly saw a lady's silhouette in the shower, and she took off everything on her, slipping in right next to him. To be honest, she had a body to die for, so it wasn't Azuma's fault that he was sweating to the depths of hell. The lady in question turned out to be Mizu, who was the reincarnated version of the water mage, Miyun. She praised Asuma for being so good at everything and said she couldn't help getting wet when he was swimming. As she stepped closer to him, Mizu said she wanted to know him better, but something about her presence was very familiar and very strange, too powerful to be the presence of an ordinary academy student. Anyway, just in case she was blind, he had to remind her that she was in the boys' bathroom and asked if she got in by mistake. But the thought confirmed that she was indeed in the right place, and she wasn't even scared when he told her to watch out because other boys could find her. Suddenly, she stared with devious eyes and had so much darkness behind her words as she said there was no one else in the building besides the both of them. Azuma was surprised and wondered where the other students disappeared to, but he suddenly noticed that the entire bathroom had changed and the water was strange. He turned on the shower and his instincts quickly picked up on the feeling that something was coming. It was a magical attack involving water and some strange magical circles, and Azuma knew he could be in grave danger if he stayed a little longer. He firstly decided to create some distance so he could analyze the situation, so he ran quickly for his life, heading towards the door. But to his greatest shock, his enemy was right there waiting for him, looking like the fastest way for Asuma to lose his V card. He was surprised that she caught up to him that quickly, but she read his thoughts perfectly and told him to get changed before she'd lose control. Meanwhile, Asuma wasn't sure how she could catch up to him so easily except through teleportation magic. But he couldn't prove that either because there were no traces of any spell cast. He later decided to play along with her, so he'd figure a way out of her trap sooner rather than later. While they both got dressed, Mizu told him that there was no reason for him to be so cautious, because if she wanted to harm him she'd have attacked at times, but her only goal was to see that Asuma knew everything about who she was before making his decision. Azuma didn't know or understand whatever she meant by knowing everything concerning her, so he simply remained silent through it all. He was about to go his separate way when Mizu called him back and told him that she wanted to introduce herself properly to him. She was apparently the strongest student in the academy and the only lady in S4, one who was even more popular and had tons of followers. But even after her impressive intro, Asuma wasn't hyped or anything. So Mizu became a crybaby, asking him to react even just a little. Instantly, Aram knew what he'd been feeling all along was the aura of Miyun, the water mage. This made her even more dangerous to handle, and he had to find a way to uncover her secret. First of all, the magic she used earlier wasn't ancient magic, so it could only mean that she had mastered a new form of modern magic. She noticed him staring intently and told him exactly why she wanted to be alone with him. She began by listing some animals whose female forms depended on the males for survival, hence sacrificing them. She also informed him that there weren't any animal species where the male ate the female and that she wanted to be devoured by a strong and exceptional man like him. Before he knew it, Mizu had already transformed into some water goddess state of the sort, as she went on yapping about being a submissive. She believed the raw masculinity she was looking for was something only Azuma could give to her, because he took down those guys with ease and he was certainly taking notes from 50 Shades of Grey. Now she felt they'd be compatible together because they were both creeps. Somehow, she managed to slash a portion of Asuma's hair without him noticing, and although he was yet to know the trick she was using to pull that off, he was determined to discover it, so he gladly accepted her challenge. Will Azuma dominate Mizu, or will she pin him down first? To find out in part 2, comment Zaddy Asuma.